Could America have hidden paranormal encounters reported by troops in Vietnam's jungles? Tonight, we go inside the war and into the shadows to ask if the United States buried what soldiers swore they saw. In 1968, a squad pushed through a blackwater ravine near the A Shau Valley. The radio hissed. The canopy pressed down. Then, voices, not speaking but mourning, circling the trees like smoke. Men froze. One raised his rifle. Another whispered a prayer. The sergeant marked the map, then scratched it out minutes later. You'll want to know why. Here's a fact you can check right now. The U.S. Army ran real ghost broadcasts during the war, Operation Wandering Soul, haunting recordings designed to frighten the enemy. But these voices weren't coming from any loudspeaker. No team was out there. No speakers, no allies. Just the jungle. And something walking between the trees. The after-action note vanished. The men didn't. Years later, two of them told the same story without knowing the other had talked. Was it a trick of the mind, a weapon gone wrong, or something the military could not explain and would not admit? Hold your breath, because what began as a psyop became a question the war never answered. And that question, the jungle that listens night in the Central Highlands is not just dark. It is layered. There is the darkness of the trees, slick with rain. There is the darkness of the ground, swallowed by roots and water. And there is the darkness that sits above all of it, a lid of cloud steeped in heat and thunder, pressing down hard enough to bend the spine. The squad filed through it single file, boots sinking to the ankle, sleeves pasted to skin, leeches finding warm places no one wants to talk about. The point man raised his fist and the world stopped moving. The world did not stop breathing. A drip fell from a leaf. A moth brushed a cheek. Somewhere out there, someone stepped where no one should be. It wasn't an animal. Animals announce themselves with rustle, with snap, with the innocent clatter of bodies that don't care who hears them. This was careful. Human careful. Or something else that had learned to be. The radio operator shifted the handset against his ear. The battery was full, the frequency set. The voice that should have been on the other end replaced by a whisper of static like silk pulled slow. He said nothing because there was nothing to say. The sergeant tapped the point man's shoulder and they drifted forward, bayonets catching brief threads of starlight that shouldn't have made it through the canopy but did. Then it came. Not a word, not a sentence. A sound like grief made language. It rose from the ravine, climbed the trunk of a kapok tree, and spread across the air in a thin sheet of sorrow. A man behind the sergeant said a name he hadn't said since home. The name left his mouth and didn't fall. It hung there, caught, as if the jungle wanted to keep it. In training, they teach you to split yourself. Part of you listens for tripwires and the ping of insects against your teeth. Part of you watches the ground for the trap door of a tunnel mouth. Part of you is already dead, and you're careful with the rest. That night demanded a fourth part. It asked them to listen to something they couldn't see, to watch the air as if the air could reach out and touch them back. The sergeant drew a small circle on the map. He didn't like to write what he couldn't defend, but he wrote something anyway, a shorthand only he could read. A minute later, he took the pencil and turned the circle into a smudge. The paper tore. He folded it once and slid it into his pocket. They moved again. The sound moved with them, not louder, not closer, just present, like a hand resting lightly on a shoulder you can't shrug off. The jungle insists on illusions. Fog becomes figures. Branches become rifles. But this wasn't vision. It was volume in the shape of grief. The men did not fire because you can't fire at a feeling. They kept walking because walking is what stands between a patrol and a story that ends too soon. Dawn doesn't arrive in Vietnam so much as leak. The sky goes from black to bruised to the color of old teeth. Birds take turns deciding who sings first. The squad reached a low rise and found the remains of a camp. Ash in a shallow fire pit, still damp. Footprints dragging into the river and not coming out. A strip of cloth tied to a branch, pale with age, flapping even when the air went still. The point man raised his fist again, but this time the world kept breathing, hard and fast. The radio found its voice. Headquarters sounded like a room inside a metal box. The sergeant spoke steady, made it routine. Contact negative, signs of recent movement, river crossing likely. He did not speak of morning sounds or names caught in air. He knew better. He heard it anyway, layered behind the crackle as if the frequency had picked up more than a voice. Here is the first payoff, and it changes how you'll hear everything that follows. The men learned later that the army had recorded and broadcast ghostly wails and sorrowful monologues into the jungle, a tactic meant to spook enemy fighters steeped in ancestor beliefs. Operation Wandering Soul, real tapes, real speakers slung under helicopters and hidden in the trees. But the timeline didn't fit that night. No broadcast scheduled in their sector. No loudspeaker team deployed. No friendly unit near enough to pip the signal. And still the grief moved with them. Check the documents and you find a confirmation of the psyop. Check the unit logs and you find silence where the sergeant's pencil smudge should have been. If you're already leaning forward, if you want to go deeper into the war's strangest files and the night's veterans still talk about in low voices, stay with me. Subscribe. Tap the bell. Share this with the one friend who loves a good mystery, because in a few minutes we'll play a fragment of an authentic ghost tape and place it beside a soldier's memory that no tape can explain. They rested for an hour, sitting on their packs, steam lifting from their shirts. No one slept. The youngest of them, a kid from a town where the tallest building was the grain elevator, stared at the strip of cloth on the branch as if it might open its mouth. He'd volunteered because his father had, and his father had come home with hands that shook only when the room went quiet. The kid thought he understood fear. He did not understand this. When the wind rose, the cloth snapped like a command. They moved again, east toward a bald hill the map had tattooed with harmless contour lines. On the way, they found a place where the brush had been cut not by machete but by something hot. Leaves curled inward, slick with sap, edges crisped. A patch of grass had fused into a dark crust like glass in the shape of a puddle. One man said flare, another said lightning, a third said nothing at all. The sergeant knelt and barely touched it. It was warm, though the morning wasn't. They heard it twice more before noon. Once, while crossing a shallow stream, the sound sinking into the water and rising at their knees like voices trapped under glass. Once in a dry, sandy clearing where termites had built towers like little cathedrals. The second time, the words felt closer to language, a tone that could have been pleading or warning, the kind of human sound that scrapes bone whether you speak the language or not. The kid from the grain town took a step back and his heel cracked a termite tower in half. The sound stopped. The silence felt like a held breath that belonged to the jungle, not to them. They reached the bald hill at midday, and the light was so bright it felt fake, as if the sky had been peeled open and someone was shining a lamp at them from outside the world. The horizon rippled. Heat shimmered. Down in the distance, the treetops were a green sea. If you wanted to believe they moved like water, you could. The radio coughed again. A different voice this time, clipped and fast, asking them to confirm grid and direction. The sergeant did. The voice told them to hold position, then added, almost as an afterthought, to avoid broadcasting unnecessary remarks. The operator looked at the sergeant. The sergeant said nothing. The voice returned to its box and the air around the men felt newly crowded, as if now the jungle knew their names. On the far side of the hill was a cut in the earth, not natural. Once, maybe long ago, someone had dug into the slope and carved a mouth. The entrance had collapsed, roots stitched across it. But the ground bore the old geometry of human intention. The sergeant told two men to stay on the crest and the rest to fan left. He went right, sliding along the slope, palm against mud, eyes on the tree line. And that was when he saw the mark. It was etched low in the dirt, half covered by a spill of pebbles and rain. Not a letter he recognized, not a glyph he could name, but a curve with a hook and a line that looked like a path that doubles back on itself. He brushed it with the side of his hand. The mark wasn't cut. It was impressed, as if something heavy had laid it there and the dirt remembered. For a moment he saw the curve as a river and the line as a bridge, and felt the small, irrational certainty that the mark was a map to somewhere just behind his shoulder. He did not turn around. He stood up slow and walked back to the crest. He told no one about the mark. Records say he was not a superstitious man. Records are often written by men who don't want to be misunderstood. The first shot of the day came in late afternoon from a place that offered no target. It snapped past the point man's ear and shattered a knot in a tree, and a splinter lodged in his neck. He fell, rolled, came up on a knee. The second shot hit a termite tower and kicked dust. The third, fourth, fifth stitched a neat line across a log as if an invisible seamstress were practicing on wood. The men dug in, eyes slicing the tree line, fingers tight. The radio asked for direction and distance, but every man on the hill heard the truth at the same time. The shots weren't coming from anywhere you could point to. They were around them, patterned like rain, landing where fear already lived. Then the voices returned. Not mourning this time, not even human. They came as a chorus of low vowels, as if the earth were trying to speak through a throat full of mud. The air vibrated. The leaves trembled without wind. For a breath and another breath, the men were sure they stood on the lid of a drum and someone was striking it beneath their boots. Rock apes, red eyes, and the ridge that wouldn't sleep. The jungle had moods. Some nights it whispered like a woman telling secrets. Other nights it screamed like a storm. But the worst nights were the ones when it listened and waited. 2 days after the voices, the patrol was reassigned to a ridge north of Da Krong. The orders were simple: observe, report, and avoid engagement. But even before they reached the ridge, every man knew they were walking toward something that didn't fit in a mission log. They called it Hill 875-12 because it sat half a mile east of the real Hill 875, the one everyone remembered for the bloodbath months earlier. This one, though, wasn't on any map. The ridgeline curved like a spine, thick with bamboo and elephant grass, and the deeper they went, the quieter it became. By dusk, the cicadas had stopped. Not faded out, stopped. The sergeant said nothing. He just motioned for perimeter setup. They formed a loose circle, rifles out, trip flares placed, and waited for night. At 2300 hours, the first rock came down. It hit the ground near the radio man with a dull thud. Then another, each one heavier, more deliberate. No gunfire, no footsteps, just the soft, terrible rhythm of stones landing closer and closer to the camp. The kid from the grain town aimed his M16 at the darkness. Apes, someone muttered. The others half laughed, half hoped. Rock apes, the local nickname for massive primates rumored to live deep in the Annamite range. Most soldiers treated the stories like a joke told over beer. But tonight no one was laughing. Then came the eyes. 2 points of red hovering in the brush, level with a man's chest. They blinked once, slow, deliberate, and vanished. Another pair appeared higher up the ridge. Then another, 3 sets. 4. The night filled with breath they couldn't hear but could feel. A vibration low and steady, like a drumbeat under the ground. The sergeant hissed, "Hold fire." No one did. Flashes tore through the darkness. Bullets sliced bamboo, ripped through leaves, shattered air. The jungle screamed back, high, guttural howls that twisted from animal to something almost human. The sound wasn't coming from one place. It was everywhere at once, bouncing between the trees, inside the ears, under the skin. When the echoes faded, the ridge fell silent again. The men swept the area at dawn. No bodies, no blood, no tracks except their own. But the rocks were still there, smooth, round, and heavy enough to break a skull. The radio man picked one up and frowned. Its surface wasn't rough like riverstone. It was glassy, melted, as if it had passed through fire. Back at base, their report got flagged for atmospheric distortion and enemy psychological tactics. The sergeant protested until his voice turned hoarse. The lieutenant shrugged and told him to rest. "You've been out there too long," he said. "Sometimes the jungle talks back." That night, the sergeant dreamed of red eyes blinking behind rain. When he woke, he found the same smooth stone sitting beside his cot. No one had seen who put it there. A week later, another platoon went up the ridge. Their after-action report vanished within days. What leaked out through rumor was stranger still. A machine gun jammed mid-fire, though the barrel wasn't hot. A man vanished from the rear guard without a sound. No struggle, no drag marks. His buddy swore he saw him turn to look back, smile faintly, and walk into the trees. And then something else. A pilot from a supply chopper passing overhead reported fluctuating heat signatures across the ridge, large shapes moving in formation, too symmetrical to be animals. The techs said it was ground fog mixed with interference from burning fields. The pilot disagreed. "Fog doesn't move uphill," he said, "and it doesn't look back at you." By now, the ridge had earned its nickname, the ridge that wouldn't sleep. The locals avoided it. The Americans avoided talking about it, but a few intelligence officers didn't. They pulled the sergeant aside one humid morning, handed him a black folder, and asked him what exactly he'd seen. He told them about the rocks, the red eyes, the glassy stone, the missing man. They listened without blinking. Then one of them, a man with a clean shirt and empty eyes, slid a photo across the table. It showed a creature half buried in mud, long arms, thick shoulders, face blurred by rain. "Taken near Laos, 1967, the man said. "You ever see anything like this?" The sergeant didn't answer. Because he had. But here's where the story twists. The folder wasn't just full of strange photos. There were memos, too, dated months before their ridge encounter. Memos referencing unclassified primate interference incidents, psychological conditioning field tests, and something called Project Silent Echo. One line was underlined twice. Subject phenomena consistent with unidentified biological or extra-dimensional entities reported since early 1965. He closed the folder. The man smiled and took it back. "That's all for now, Sergeant. Get some rest." 2 days later, the sergeant's transfer orders arrived. Temporary leave, medical reason listed as combat stress disorder. He never went back to the ridge. He never found out what the others saw. But others did. In 1972, years after the squad's first encounter, a CIA field memo surfaced briefly in Saigon before being buried again. It mentioned a cryptid confrontation near the Ho Chi Minh Trail involving American and ARVN troops. 3 soldiers dead, 2 missing. The memo's last line read, "No further documentation recommended. Classify under enemy wildlife hazards." Yet, veterans from both sides spoke years later. Some described red eyes. Some described screams that froze the blood. A few mentioned something worse, a shape that mimicked their own voices. One North Vietnamese survivor said it best. "It knew our language before we spoke it." The sergeant's grandson found his notebook decades later. The last page, water-stained but legible, had 4 words written in the same heavy pencil. It wasn't apes listening. And that brings us to a truth the records can't hide anymore. Something ancient walked those ridges long before the war. Something that didn't care about flags, sides, or politics. The jungle wasn't haunted by ghosts of men. It was haunted by what men had disturbed. Even today, satellite imagery shows unnatural scorch patterns around Hill 875-12. Rings of vegetation dying in perfect symmetry, like something beneath the soil had exhaled heat. Scientists blame old chemical exposure, leftover from defoliants. But the rings are still expanding, year by year, as if the ridge itself is still breathing. The kid from the grain town, older now, gray and quiet, once told a journalist over whiskey that he heard it again in 1983. Not in a dream, on his farm. Through the trees. That same rhythm of stones landing softly on the earth. He didn't go outside. He never did again. Was it the jungle's memory? A military experiment lost to rumor? Or something that had followed him home? The answer, like the war, refuses to stay buried. Because the jungle still listens. And sometimes, it remembers your name. The next chapter begins where reason starts to burn. When soldiers look up and realize the sky above Vietnam wasn't empty either. Fire in the sky, fire on the ground. It began with light. Not gunfire, not flares, not the slow burn of napalm licking the treetops, but a silent flash that turned night into glass. For a single heartbeat, every shadow stood still. The jungle glowed pale blue, and every leaf looked carved from metal. Then the light blinked out and darkness came crashing back like a closing door. The men on the ridge said nothing. Silence was safety. But silence also had teeth. The radio crackled once and died. The sergeant smacked it, heard a faint hum, and then a voice. A voice that didn't belong to any human frequency. It rose and fell in mechanical pulses, then flattened into what sounded like a single, drawn-out breath. They thought it was interference, until the breath turned into a word, not English, not Vietnamese. Something slower, like the jungle speaking through a throat that had forgotten how. The sound made their skin crawl. Then it was gone, and all that remained was the smell, ozone and metal, like a lightning strike that never touched the ground. By dawn, the ridge looked wrong. The bamboo had curled in on itself, leaves bleached white as bone. The soil was cracked and hot. One man swore the air shimmered like heat above a fire, though the temperature had dropped overnight. Another said his compass spun without stopping. The sergeant ordered them to pack up, but before they left, he caught sight of something buried halfway in the dirt. A helmet, not one of theirs. Soviet pattern, dented and blackened. Inside it, melted glass pooled in a perfect circle. That night, the men bivouacked near a river. The moon hung low and red, the kind of red that stains the water instead of reflecting off it. Half the squad tried to sleep. The others stared at the sky, waiting for the next flash. It came around midnight, only this time it moved. A bright sphere, the size of a jeep, floating between the trees without touching them. It glided so smoothly it made the air look thick. One of the men, the radio operator, whispered that it might be a flare caught in an updraft. Another said it was a drone, though none of them had ever seen one that silent. The orb hovered above the river. Then it tilted, and from its underside, thin streams of light dripped into the water like liquid fire. The river hissed, steam rising and twisting ropes. The men raised their rifles, but the sergeant stopped them with a single word. "Watch." The sphere pulsed once, twice, and then darted straight upward. So fast it vanished before anyone blinked. The steam drifted back, revealing something beneath the surface. Dead fish floating belly up. Each one split down the center, skin burned not by flame but by something cold. Morning brought no explanations. The sergeant logged what he'd seen, minus the parts no one would believe. Unidentified aerial illumination. Possible enemy tech. Observed heat distortion. He left out the voice from the radio. He left out the smell. He left out the feeling that whatever hovered above them had been looking for something, and might not have found it yet. 2 nights later, they were pulled from the field and flown to a base near Pleiku. An intelligence officer, same blank-eyed type as before, asked them to repeat what they'd seen. The sergeant told him about the light, the melted vegetation, the dead fish. The officer listened, expression unreadable, then asked one question. "Did any of your men experience physical side effects? Skin irritation? Metallic taste?" The sergeant hesitated. The radio operator had nosebleeds since that night. Another man said his hands felt numb, but the sergeant shook his head. The officer nodded once, slid a sealed envelope across the table, and said, "You'll redeploy in 48 hours. Different sector." When the sergeant opened the envelope later, it wasn't orders. It was a map, one that showed no names, only grid lines and red circles. At the center was a symbol he'd seen before, the curved mark from the hill. The same hook and line, printed in faint black ink. That night, the base lost power. The sky outside lit up again, only this time soldiers all over camp saw it. The orb returned, this time brighter, larger, moving like it was searching the ground. A siren went off. Anti-aircraft crews scrambled, but before they could fire, the sphere split into 3 smaller lights. One shot north, one east, one straight up, disappearing into the storm clouds. The next morning, the officer was gone. So was the map. What remained was the crater. Behind the mess hall, a hole 6 feet wide, edges smooth as porcelain. The soil inside wasn't burned, it was fused. Like the ridge, like the melted stones. The engineers said lightning. The medics said stress. The sergeant said nothing. A week later, word spread through the unit. A chopper from a nearby base had gone missing. The last transmission was short, half garbled, but one line made it through clearly. Bright light. Moving fast. It's right. Static. Then silence. Search teams found the wreckage 2 days later. The metal looked folded, not shattered. There were no bodies, no blood. Just a black smear on the fuselage that shimmered faintly in daylight. When they tested it for residue, the Geiger counter clicked once, then died. The sergeant requested a transfer. It was denied. That night he heard the radio hum again. The same low breath, the same impossible word. He switched frequencies, but the sound followed. A soft whisper now, rhythmic, almost gentle. He thought it was interference until he realized it was matching his pulse. He unplugged the radio. The sound kept going. By dawn, his hands were trembling. The men said nothing, but they could see it too. The way his skin looked paler, as if the blood itself had thinned. The radio operator told him quietly that he'd begun dreaming in static. In the dream, he said, the light wasn't just above them, it was inside the trees, pulsing with the beat of something alive. When the sergeant reported the next morning, the CO called it exhaustion. Gave them 3 days to rest. They spent it cleaning rifles that no longer worked right. Metal parts rusted overnight, optics fogged from within. The smell of ozone lingered long after the storms had passed. On the final night, a transport helicopter descended to pick up wounded. The floodlights cut across the base. For a moment, they caught something hanging above the tree line. A shimmer, barely visible, like air bending. The pilot saw it too. His voice trembled through the headset. "Something's up there." The sergeant stepped out, looked up. There was nothing, just stars. But stars don't move. One shifted slightly, then another. A cluster of them began to slide, slowly forming a perfect triangle. The radio operator whispered, "It's signaling." The lights blinked in sequence. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. Or maybe not. Then they winked out one by one until the sky was empty again. Later that night, the base dogs went wild, barking at nothing, straining at chains until their throats bled. Men woke to the sound of flapping canvas, but the tents were still. When morning came, the jungle around the base looked untouched, but something was missing. Birdsong. Not one call, not one flutter. Just whined and the faint crackle of distant thunder that never came closer. That was the last entry in the sergeant's notebook before he was reassigned stateside. He didn't write again. But 2 years later, in a declassified fragment from the Defense Technical Liaison Office, a name appeared beside a single note. Subject 4C, exposure to unidentified aerial phenomena. Cognitive distortion observed. Recommend continued observation under civilian status. The sergeant's grandson, years later, would describe how his grandfather would sit on the porch at night, eyes locked on the tree line, muttering about the sky that hums. He never looked up, because maybe he was afraid of what would look back. And the strange part? Satellite records show that for 6 months in 1969, that sector of jungle was off-limits even to recon flights. No public reason ever given. But one notation survives in the archive log, written in shaky pen beside a sealed folder. Residual light activity persists. Do not disturb, now. The jungle's secrets were no longer just in the trees. Something had started watching from above, and soon it would come closer than anyone expected. Black lines and vanishing files, it started with a letter that should never have survived. A single page, folded and refolded until the creases looked like scars. It arrived in a box of medals and field gear that the sergeant's grandson inherited after his death. Most of it was ordinary. Dog tags, a dull compass, a lighter engraved with initials long worn away. But the letter wasn't addressed to anyone. It just said, "If you're reading this, it means they didn't find it." The handwriting shook. Words pressed hard into the paper as if written by someone who knew time was running out. It read, "They lied about what was in the jungle. It wasn't ours. It wasn't theirs. But they made contact anyway. They buried it under PSYOPs. Check the files. Project Silence, Operation Echo Fall, the Black Ridge." Then a line that didn't sound like the rest. "They told me grief can be used as a weapon. But what if grief answers back?" That letter pulled the grandson into a hunt he didn't mean to start. He wasn't a soldier. He was a history student, the kind who loved dusty archives and stories too strange to fit in textbooks. But curiosity is a kind of inheritance too, and once he read that letter, he couldn't let it go. He filed a Freedom of Information request. Then another. Then 20 more. Months passed. The responses came back stamped in the same thick black ink. Whole paragraphs gone. Sentences replaced by empty lines. But a few words slipped through. Psychological acoustic emissions. Unidentified aerial incident. Subject interference patterns. All linked to the same year, 1968. All linked to Vietnam. He didn't tell anyone. Not at first. But the silence around those documents felt heavier than paper should. The more he read, the more it felt like he wasn't the only one reading back. One night, buried in microfilm at the National Archives, he found something that shouldn't have been there. A photo strip misfiled in a box marked Defoliant Field Tests. 5 images, faded and grainy. The first showed a jungle clearing. The second, the same clearing but scorched, a circular burn spreading outward like a sunspot. The third, light. A shape that wasn't a flare, wasn't a helicopter, wasn't anything he recognized. A streak frozen midair, bright and curved like a wound in the sky. The fourth, soldiers standing near the edge of the burn, faces blurred, eyes reflecting something out of frame. The fifth, blank, only static. He looked at the file label again. Pleiku Sector. December 1968, Echo Fall Report. The name from the letter. He took a photo of the strip on his phone. Later, when he checked it, the image glitched. Every time he opened the photo, it blurred differently, as if erasing itself pixel by pixel. He thought it was a bug, until he realized only those 5 images did it. He began to sleep less. He began to dream more. In the dreams, there was always light. And underneath it, the sound of mourning, faint but close, the same tone his grandfather had described. Then one morning, he received a call from a man who said he was retired military intelligence. No name, no rank, just an old voice that sounded tired of keeping things. "I heard you've been looking where you shouldn't," the voice said. "You want answers, don't you?" The grandson said yes. "Then listen carefully," the voice whispered. They made contact in 68, not with the enemy, with something that was already there. You think it's about UFOs? It's not. It's about communication, about grief that isn't human. They tried to talk to it. The line went dead. That night, he opened his laptop to search Operation Echo Fall. The screen flickered. A pop-up flashed once, a single file name before vanishing. It read, Jungle. Subject 04C log.wav. The code number matched a note from the FOIA files, the same as his grandfather's case. He found it again, buried deep in an old military FTP mirror. He clicked play, static, then a hum, then breathing. A voice, faint and distant, whispering something he couldn't quite make out. He adjusted the volume. The sound grew clearer. Words took shape. It said his grandfather's name. He slammed the laptop shut. The hum didn't stop. It came from inside the walls, faint at first, then rising like a pulse. He yanked the power cord, cut the breaker. Silence. But as he stood in the dark, he realized silence had texture. It was full of sound waiting to be heard. He left town the next day. Weeks later, he drove south to find the ridge. It took time, old maps and one local guide who didn't like questions. The jungle was thicker now, but still carried that same heat, the kind that made your thoughts move slower. By dusk, he reached the coordinates from the files. The clearing was real. The trees bowed inward, blackened at the tips. In the center, a shallow depression, too perfect to be natural. He ran his hand along the soil. Warm, almost buzzing. Then he heard it. A low vibration, like thunder under the ground. He stepped back and the ground trembled once, softly. Something below shifted. He stumbled, caught his balance and froze. There was a sound, a mechanical click, old but precise. From the brush nearby, a shape emerged. A rusted field recorder, half buried, its red light still blinking weakly after decades. He crouched. The recorder's label was worn away except for one scratched word. Echo Fall. He pressed play, voices, dozens of them, layered over each other. Men shouting, radios hissing, then that same tone, the same mournful wail his grandfather had described. Then a single line rose above the noise, clear and human. Do not answer it. Whatever it is, do not answer. The tape snapped. The jungle went still. He turned to leave, but the light around him had changed. The sky glowed faintly, though the sun was gone. The air shimmered in bands like heat waves underwater. And in that moment he saw it. Not with his eyes, but somewhere behind them. A memory that didn't belong to him. The ridge, full of men. The blue light descending. The ground splitting open. The sound of voices crying out, not in pain, but in recognition. He blinked, and the vision was gone. The jungle was quiet again. He drove out that night without looking back. But when he reached the nearest town, the local police pulled him over. "Your headlights," the officer said. "They're burned out." He looked. The bulbs weren't broken. They'd melted. Back home, the grandson mailed everything. The tape, the letter, the copies of the photos, to an investigative journalist he trusted. The next week, the journalist vanished. His office emptied overnight. The paper ran a short note. Due to legal restrictions, ongoing coverage has been discontinued. The grandson stopped looking after that. He moved to the coast, got a job that didn't involve archives or war stories. But sometimes, on humid nights, when the air gets thick and the world feels far away, he hears the hum again. Only now, it hums in rhythm with the sea. He keeps the letter locked in a drawer he never opens. But if you look closely, there's something new on the last line. Letters faintly raised under the original ink like someone traced over them later. They form a single sentence, barely legible. The jungle is listening again. And somewhere, deep under those same trees, a light flickers once more, waiting for an answer no one dares to give. The last night March rain came early that season, thick as poured glass, hammering the jungle into a blur of motion. It wasn't weather anymore, it was punishment. The kind that erased footprints before they finished being made. On nights like this, the war felt distant, almost forgotten, as if something older had taken its place. The sergeant had once said that every jungle has a memory, and Vietnam's was the kind that didn't forgive. His grandson hadn't wanted to believe that. But now, walking through the same soaked earth 50 years later, every step felt watched. He'd told himself this trip was closure, to leave his grandfather's story where it began. Yet each mile deeper into the green made that word feel smaller, more ridiculous. His guide, a quiet man named Bao, walked ahead, machete swinging rhythmically. He didn't speak much English, but he understood why they were there. Or maybe he didn't need to. Some stories don't need translation. When the rain broke, fog took its place, rolling between the trees like smoke. The sound of insects dimmed until only the patter of dripping leaves remained. Bao stopped. He looked back with an expression that wasn't fear, but recognition, as if they'd stepped into a place he'd been warned about as a child. They had reached the hill, the same ridge marked 87512 in his grandfather's notebook. The trees there were different, thinner, almost skeletal, their bark streaked with black resin. In the center stood what looked like an old radio tower base, rusted steel bones half swallowed by vines. But there was no tower anymore, just cables snaking into the ground. Bao refused to go closer. He murmured something that sounded like a prayer and gestured toward the clearing. Then he backed away into the mist, leaving the grandson alone. The air felt charged, like the second before lightning strikes. He raised his camera, but the moment the lens faced the clearing, static filled the screen. Not digital interference. Actual static like an old TV in a storm. He lowered it, heart pounding. Then came the sound. Faint at first, a soft hum, almost gentle. Then deeper, layered, vibrating through the soil. The same hum his grandfather had written about. It pulsed like breathing. He stepped forward, drawn toward the rusted base, until his boot brushed something half buried in the mud. A canteen. U.S. issue. Still intact, Initials scratched on the side. TW, the radio operator from his grandfather's unit. He froze. The metal was warm, almost hot. He looked around, half expecting to see someone standing there, and that's when he saw it, an outline behind the mist. A figure, tall and thin, standing motionless at the tree line. The fog shifted, revealing the shape of a man in tattered fatigues. His head tilted slowly, unnaturally, as if bones remembered movement long after flesh forgot it. "Grandpa?" the grandson whispered before his brain could stop him. The figure didn't move. It just stared. Then, without sound, it turned and walked deeper into the jungle, each step vanishing like smoke. He followed. Branches whipped at his face. Mud clung to his legs, but the figure stayed ahead, always at the edge of sight. The air grew colder. The jungle's sounds fell away entirely. And then, suddenly, he stepped into another clearing. And everything was wrong. There were no trees. No rain. Just scorched earth stretching in every direction, the soil cracked and steaming. In the center stood a circle of light, not shining from above, but glowing from below. Within it, objects floated inches off the ground, broken rifles, a helmet, a dog tag spinning slowly in place. The hum grew louder until it became a pressure inside his skull. He fell to his knees, covering his ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't entering through them, it was inside him, like something speaking directly to the marrow of his bones. Words formed, not English, not any language he knew, but somehow he understood their meaning. "We were here before you. You called to us. You listened too long." He tried to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The light surged brighter, swallowing color, time, sound. For a heartbeat, he saw flashes, men firing into the trees, shadows watching from above, a figure standing in the rain whispering into a radio that had no power. Then everything went white. When he opened his eyes, he was lying at the edge of the ridge. The light was gone. The canteen was gone. The air was still. Only Bao stood nearby, staring down at him with wide, terrified eyes. "You hear it?" Bao asked softly. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His ears still rang with the echo of something that didn't belong to this world. They left before sunset. Wordless, both men walking faster than they realized. When they reached the village, Bao refused payment. He simply said, "The forest doesn't forget faces," and disappeared into the rain. Back in the city, the grandson tried to make sense of what had happened. He developed the footage. Most of it was blank, but one frame caught his breath. A single still from the clearing, faint and grainy, showing figures, 7 of them, standing in formation. Their uniforms blurred, their faces streaked with light. One looked exactly like his grandfather. He printed it, hands trembling, and turned the page of the old letter for comparison. But something had changed. The last line, the one that once read, "The jungle is listening again," was now darker, the ink fresher, as if someone had written over it recently. Underneath it, new words had appeared. Not typed, handwritten, his grandfather's script. It never stopped. That night, the hum returned, not from the walls, not from any machine, but from the air itself, low and steady, vibrating through the floorboards. He went to the window. Outside, the sky glowed faintly, blue at first, then white, spreading across the clouds like a wound reopening. Somewhere far away, deep in the jungles of Vietnam, the ridge pulsed once more, alive with the same breathless light that had haunted generations. And in that silence between thunder and dawn, the jungle began to whisper again, calling the names of men who were never supposed to be found. The sound carried across oceans, across time, finding anyone who dared to listen. And if you listen closely, you might hear it too,